So then we get the question of, we have this goal of transitioning between these two states. Like over here, I've clicked the popular tag of Elm, and over here, I've clicked the popular tag of programming, and we want the page to look different in those two scenarios. So how can we get it to look different using this one view function? Well, basically, this question boils down to, how can we transition from the initial model to a different model that has a different tag selected? How do we get from the one to the other? Because if we can do that, as long as Vue is capable of rendering a different thing based on which model it gets, as long as we can transition from one model to the other and have Vue get called again with the updated model, then we should be good. It should successfully render the new page as we want it. So the link between these two that causes that transition to happen is called update. So update is another function, much like Vue, and it takes two arguments. So one of the arguments is the model. Same thing as Vue. Model represents the entire application state. The other argument is called message. So essentially what the message does is message is something that comes from the outside world that tells update sort of like what happened recently and lets update figure out what to do. Ultimately, what we want update to do here is to do something like this record update that says, I want to take my model and keep everything about it the same, except I want to change the selected tag to Elm because the user clicked on the Elm selected tag. So this is going to return a new model. And that's sort of what update's job is to return a new model that describes the new application state. So whereas Vue's job was to return a description of how the page should look, update's job is to transition between application states. It's to say, we started off with this state, but based on what most recently happened in terms of user interaction or something else, now we want to transition to this new state. And the way that it does that is it just returns what the new application state ought to be. Message is sort of the way that it knows what to transition to. This is a value that comes in from the outside world that describes what just happened. So this could be a user interaction, like for example, the user clicked on one of these tags. It could be the user typing something in. Or it could even be, as we will later see, something like a message coming in from the server. Point is, a message describes something that just happened. Using these two ingredients of the message and the model, we can decide what new model to return. Here's an example of something we could use for message. We get to decide the format of message. I've chosen this particular format, but we're actually going to evolve this over the course of the workshop to a different format. But for now, this is a good starting point. We're just using a record. We're saying update gets a record for its message that has a description of clicked tag, which is sort of a pretty straightforward description of what happened. And then it's got a little piece of extra data which describes which tag the user clicked. So by looking at these two pieces of information, update can say, I see what happened. The user clicked a particular tag. I'm going to change the application state to reflect that. The way that this is going to get into update is by specifying it as an on-click handler in the view. So when the view is rendering or describing this button that the user is going to click to send a message to update, here's how it does it. There's a function called onClick, which takes as an argument the exact message that's going to be sent to update when the click happens. And then that's actually just a plain old attribute that we can put inside of our button. So just like we had class as one of the attributes that can go in a button, onClick is another one. Event handlers go in that same first list of attributes that get passed to every element. So button, onClick, and then a record. What this code does is it means that not only are we rendering a tag button that has the text of Elm, but also we're specifying whenever the user clicks this button, this message should get sent to update along with the current model. And then based on that, update's going to potentially transition us to a new model. It's going to say, I am going to change our application state from what it was before to this new application state based on the message and based on the existing model. So to see this in diagram form, we have our current application state that gets passed into Vue. Vue renders some HTML, which now includes some buttons with on-click handlers. The runtime takes care of wiring all that up, all the event listeners, does all that for us. When the user clicks that button that says Elm, the runtime is going to send that message that we specified in our HTML that the Vue returned as an argument to update along with the current model. And then update says, okay, based on that, I'm now going to probably do a record update to set the currently selected tag. And then based on that, it's going to the runtime is going to say, I see that update has given me a new model. I will pass that new model to view, which in turn will give me some new HTML, and the cycle begins all over again. Fundamentally, this is how every Elm application works. This is a complete way to describe user interaction and updating the screen based on what happened. Elm's able to do this very quickly, fortunately, because one of the great parts about the virtual DOM is it's able to diff the before and after of the description we used rather than actually mutating the DOM every time. So when it gets this HTML from view, it's going to say, oh, I see that we have had this as our previous example of how the page should look. And then I see that based on the new model, we have a new one, a new description of how the page should look. It can very quickly run through those and just diff them and figure out, I see that the only things that have changed between these two are one of these tags is selected, whereas previously a different one is selected, and also some of the articles in the feed have changed. And so it'll only make that minimal set of actual updates to the real DOM necessary to make the screen look the way that you want. So even though every time it goes through, it is building up a new description from scratch, it's not actually having to do all of that work every single time an interaction happens. So that's why Elm's able to be competitive in speed benchmarks to other libraries that are not using virtual DOMs.